FP2 has just ended for the second round of the 2024 F1 season, and we had a surprise at the top of the leaderboards, with Fernando Alonso ending FP2 the quickest of all in the session, some 2.5 tenths ahead of Mercedes' George Russell and Red Bull's Max Verstappen. The session allowed us to get our very first read on the pecking order on the Jeddah circuit in conditions which will be very similar to the ones the team will face when it comes to qualifying and, more importantly, the race. As mentioned, the surprise package of this session were undoubtedly Aston Martin, with Alonso fastest ahead of Russell. Aston Martin's compromise between downforce and drag seems to have paid dividends for them in this session, with both drivers in the top 5. With Lance Stroll only half a second off his illustrious teammate. And their race pace doesn't look that bad as well when we will later on compare it between the top 4 teams. It's actually quite interesting to see what unfolded within this session. Up in second place was Mercedes' George Russell, and for the team it was a tale of mixed fortunes, with Russell the happier of the two drivers. And he picked up where he left off in FP1, being over half a second quicker than that of Lewis Hamilton, who, in the same situation as he faced in FP1, finished the session in P8, half a second behind him. So there's a lot of work, it seems, for Hamilton to do over one lap. Interestingly, Red Bull and Max Verstappen with the RB20 were not the quickest combination out on the Jeddah street circuit tonight, with both drivers finishing in 3rd and 5th respectively, with a 10.5 between them. It was very interesting to see that Red Bull could not extract the same kind of lap time difference when going to the soft from the medium as the rest of the grid, with Verstappen only finding, to my recollection, 2 or 3 tenths in that process, whereas the rest of the grid, including Alonso, found over 7 tenths. But sadly, when it comes to race pace, it does seem like Red Bull are the leaders in this situation, as we will go into a little bit later. For Ferrari, once again, it was a very quiet session, with them going about their regular program. The team seemingly having run their engines in very low settings, as they always do. So expect much more to come from Leclerc and Sainz, who finished the session in P4 and P7 respectively, with a gap of just over 3 tenths between the pair. And rounding out the top 10 is that of Pierre Gasly for Alpine, very surprisingly, and Oscar Piastri in P10. Now, as far as looking forward to the race on Saturday, how are all the teams looking when it comes to race pace? Well, on the screen right now, you can see there's a graph of Fernando Alonso, Max Verstappen, Lewis Hamilton, Carlos Sainz, and Oscar Piastri. 5 drivers from the top 5 teams, which all ran the same tyre in FP2 during their race simulations. And as you can see, it's quite an interesting grid in terms of race pace. So as we expected, we have Verstappen on an average time, to my recollection, of a 1 minute 34 flat, and he spent quite a few laps in the high 33s as well. Coming in second in race pace was surprisingly Fernando Alonso, who had the longest stint out of all the drivers, and he lapped with an average lap time of 1 minute 34.4. This has the AMR24 seemingly having much better tyre management and race pace this time out in practice. Up next was Lewis Hamilton, who had the shortest stint of all 5 drivers, so his true pace is a little bit harder to detect, but from the data and the laps gathered on this race sim, we could see he had an average lap time of 1 minute 34.5, so very close to Alonso. Now, shockingly, looking at the race run of Ferrari's Carlos Sainz, he had a pretty atrocious race pace today, lapping a whole 8 tenths of a second slower than Verstappen and nearly half a second slower than Alonso. A lot of work will have to be done overnight by the Ferrari team to rectify this for Sunday. But even worse than that was that of Oscar Piastri, who, after having a very good Bahrain race in terms of race pace, he seems to have made a step backwards. Now, this could have been the case of the MCL 38 is just not that good on its tyres around this particular track with whatever setup they were running. And so, of course, again, just like Ferrari, a lot of time and consideration is going to be put in overnight to see whether they can find something wrong with the setup and the direction to go for the rest of the weekend. But overall, it was a very interesting day and a very exciting one at that, with Fernando Alonso and Aston Martin rounding out the session quickest. Now, a lot of changes have undergone the AMR24 from last season to this season. And what were those changes? Well, let's quickly go over those. Another major area the team have put a considerable focus on is that of the front suspension, with the team having further refined this aspect of the car. The team have further accentuated the suspension geometry this year, and it's now arched to an even more dramatic angle. These changes aim to improve the control of rate transfer, to improve cornering ability by ensuring as much of the tyre is in contact with the track surface, and secondly, to have a positive influence on the overall aero from the front wing towards the rest of the car. Moving back to one of the most notable changes from last year's AMR23 is of course their side pods. For this year, they have retained their overall shape with a few minor adjustments made to the overall design. The side pod inlet has seen the most notable change, with the team now following Red Bull's RB19 in-season update to a letterbox styled inlet. The main purpose of the change is all about increasing the airflow taken around the side pod and being fed more aggressively towards the rear end of the car. There is also an additional bonus of an improvement in cooling. The undercut beneath the side pod inlet is deeper, while the upper surface retains the distinctive downward swooping channel of the AMR24's predecessor, creating rigid side pod shoulders that guide air along the sides of the car. Another major revision that the AMR24 has undertaken is the rear suspension layout, with the team moving from a pull rod to push rod design. This change from a pull to push rod layout is primarily for aero and packaging reasons and is dependent on the overall car's philosophy. This layout change requires a massive redesign for the entire rear end of the car. This will include a redesign of the gearbox housing and insides, as the rear suspension is mounted directly on the gearbox housing. And with Aston Martin taking the Mercedes rear end and gearbox, this change was facilitated thanks to the redesign first done in-house at the Mercedes team over at Brackley and Brixworth, and is obviously something the factory at Aston Martin had to implement. For 2022 and 2023, Mercedes' gearbox was of course built around the zero pod design, and so for 2024 there's going to have to be a complete redesign of every component housed within it. The Mercedes gearbox obviously for those 2 years had a pull rod suspension layout and an inboard suspension such as a torsion bar, which is the yellow dotted line built in the middle. These inboard suspension parts are built in behind the gear cassette, which is highlighted with a red circle, and the fairing of the drive shaft is slanted and thick. This is a change that all Mercedes power teams will receive for 2024. With the factory outfit making this change on their W15 to help their anti-dive suspension layout, which they are rumoured to have developed.